Good afternoon. As you will probably have figured out by now, I am not on campus today. As I may have mentioned before, I live in Longmont, and while my house and my family are fine, it's still a little dicey trying to get out of this town. So what we decided to do is to have a video version of me today, and you have should be extra grateful and be very kind to Russell and Laura, who have very thankfully on my part helped be willing to help out to run this class today for me. So I'm not here today. My plan is to be back on campus on Wednesday, so if you need to talk to me between now and then, your best bet is to send me an email. I'm almost always available by email. I hope all of you and your families are safe and well, and if you're having any trouble because of any kind of disruption to your life based on the flood, please don't hesitate to contact me, and we'll figure out whatever we need to do to help you get caught up in class or anything else like that that you need. So right now the plan is to stay with the syllabus in terms of when the exam will be, because we have that built-in extra day for catch-up work. So I will rejigger the schedule though to get us to that day, and I will have that for us on Wednesday. So for now, just assume that we're going to be about a day behind in the reading. So you need to make sure that you've read chapter 5 by Wednesday when we have class. So this shouldn't cause too much trauma to us. So if you remember last Wednesday when we were finishing, we were talking about political parties. We started to talk about political parties. And I'm going to finish talking about that for maybe 10 or so minutes today, and then I'm going to have you guys answer a bunch of questions that I had intended to have you guys answer on Friday. And that way, the plan will be then we'll talk about those first thing on Wednesday, and then we'll move on with the other stuff that we're doing. So if you remember last Wednesday, we were talking about political parties. And you remember we talked about they had 3 primary functions, remember, to win elections, to operate government, and to determine public policy. And that they did that through their 3 main areas. So the party in government, elected officials, the party organization, so the people who actually work for the party in the state committees and who work for the precincts, who spend their time working for the party. And then the party in the electorate, the actual voters, the people who self-identify as part of the party. So what I want to do now is talk again briefly some more about what it is that parties do and the things that parties do that are important to consider when we think about the relationship between parties and interest groups. So parties are responsible for I would say let's break it down in the ways that we did when we talked about the faces of the party. So let's talk about what parties do in government that's important for us to understand when we talk about the relationship between parties and interest groups. So in terms of government, remember that parties' goal is to operate government. So they want to win elections so that they can operate government. They want to organize the way decisions get made within government, and that's both in terms of legislative decision making, so Congress and state legislatures, and of course we know that the majority and the minority parties have a huge impact on the way business gets done, not just what bills get passed and what don't, but how the process actually works for those bills to get passed. And that's also the case for the executive branches in terms of appointments and in terms of how the people on top of the departments, whether they're cabinet departments or other kinds of executive agencies, who are the ones who are sort of steering those agencies toward what the president wants. And those can be inherently partisan kinds of functions too. The reason this matters in terms of policy is because while we tend to think of party platforms as sort of these whatever, there's these things they produce, in fact, we know that 2/3 of platform planks are enacted by the presidential party when they're in power. So it is a goal to operate government in order, if you remember, to determine public policy. And so that's what they're doing. They're using their power in government to get policy passed. So that's what parties are doing in government. But we can also think about what they're doing in terms of the organization as in terms of ideology and issue positions. Now, when we think about it, parties have a interest in doing whatever ideologically will help them best to win, right? So sometimes that means pulling to the middle, right? And this is this sort of a standard political science argument about how party ideology works, that parties during an election cycle, during a general election cycle, will pull to the middle in order to get the most number of moderate centrist voters to vote for them, because that's how you get to 50% plus one. One of the other ways to think about that, though, and how party activity in presidential elections has changed over the past 15, 20 years, is that to some degree now parties are actually pulling toward the ends. They're pulling toward the ends of their ideology in order to motivate voters who might not have come out to vote. So the goal is not to get those people in the middle who are going to vote. They just don't know who they're going to vote for. The goal is to get the people on the ends who they know are going to vote for either Republican or a Democrat. They have to be motivated to actually turn out and vote. And so in that sense, you see two powers at work, both that in some cases, in some contexts, parties' ideology pushes them, or parties' goals pushes their ideology to the center, and sometimes their party goals of winning, which is always the party goal, pushes them to the extremes. And it just depends on sort of people's understanding about what the most effective way to win is. And that has a real impact on what policy, what ideology look like. I mean, think about the best example of this is the way that the Republican Party is currently operating. Now, to some degree, people get sort of upset about this and say, like, well, there's all these people in Congress who are, who are really conservative and they're backed by the Tea Party and they don't really represent the sort of average Republican voter. Well, that may or may not be the case, but what we do know is that particularly during the 2004 election, when George W. Bush was being reelected, one of the things that his campaign staff came up with, particularly Karl Rove, was this idea that there are these sort of vast numbers of conservatives who weren't coming out to vote. And that the best way to sort of make sure that George W. Bush won re-election was to energize those ends and bring them in to vote. And so what that basically did, or what we think that did, is that it brought lots of people into the system who were sort of disaffected, who weren't voting at all before. And the interesting thing, at least in terms of the Democratic response to that, is there didn't seem to be a large group of Democrats out to the left who were disaffected. And so Democrats' sort of decision to say, okay, well, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to go out to the ends and try to get more people to mobilize, hasn't panned out the same way because there just weren't that many people out there. So why do we care about that? Because that's about how the political parties deal with ideology. Is they're thinking about what is going to help me win this election? What is going to help us win this election? And it's we either have to get votes from the center, or we have to get votes from the end. And sometimes, as right now, getting votes from the end, at least for the Republicans, seems like a better choice. So what does that translate into actual voters? So this is the party in the electorate. Well, partisanship, right? So this is people's self-identification now. And to some degree, we can think of self-ID, and we're not really talking about talking about party identification as much in this course as we might in some other courses. But we can really think about that in some ways as like allegiance to a football team. Now, there is issue content, but people tend to see information, they tend to gather information through the lens of a party identification they already have. So they're much more likely to sort of take new information and filter that through their allegiance than they are to let that information maybe change their allegiance or change the strength of their allegiance. So these are the things that are the most important to think about political parties when we try to understand what's the relationship between political parties and interest groups. So think through this conversation that we've just had about the way parties deal with the organization of government and the attempt to try to get policy passed, how they deal with ideology in terms of elections and trying to think about how to help themselves win the best, and the way that focus on ideology, that focus on winning, translates into voters average voters and who self-identify with one or the other party or with no party. So thinking about all of that, what I want you to do now is I want you to answer a series of questions about the relationship between parties and interest groups. So taking all the stuff that we've talked about over the last several weeks, and you're reading about how interest groups are formed and why people join interest groups and the incentives involved, and how the interest group system works in terms of business groups and citizen groups, and in terms of mobilization and counter-mobilization. I've got a set of questions that I want you guys to answer in groups. And so there are 6 questions. Make sure that you give me 2 or 3 sentences for each one of these. And they're fairly involved questions. So you guys are going to have to think about these. Make sure that you get into groups of 3 or 4 people. Not 2, not 5, 3 or 4. Make sure you write all of your names on the top of the paper, and then as you answer all 6 of these questions. And what I'm going to ask you guys to do is to hold on to these sheets of paper and to not turn them in so that we can talk about them, so I can talk about them with you on Wednesday when we get there. So if you have any questions, the TAs will be hanging out to answer those questions. And remember, if you need to talk to me, the best way is through email. And I hope you guys have a great day. Bye.